It had been raining for days when Jonas Alden arrived at the Wicklow property, his car tires hissing against the slick gravel road winding through the dense pine woods. The fog rolled low along the road's shoulders like a creature uncertain whether it wanted to rise or crawl. The house, long abandoned and swallowed by the forest's slow hunger, stood at the end of a narrow, sagging path half buried in needles and wet leaves. No one had lived here in decades. Jonas stepped out, his boots crunching through shallow puddles, the air dense with a sour-sweet smell of moss and old rain. The wind barely moved. Trees clustered tightly around the property as though in conversation with the crumbling eaves and broken shutters of the house. Nothing about the structure looked welcoming. Its gray boards were bowed and wet, the windows smoked with grime and age, but Jonas felt no fear, only a dull hum of obligation. This was his inheritance, after all, his uncle's house, signed over in a thin envelope, and a will that arrived with no return address. He paused at the porch steps, the wood groaning under his weight, and stared up at the structure. A single bird cawed overhead, a deep rasp like an old hinge. The air felt thick. That was the only way he could describe it. The way fog closed and wasn't just physical. It pressed on the inside of his chest, as if the house were exhaling into the world around it. Every few seconds, he could swear he heard a faint rustling just beneath the surface of the quiet. Not animals, not wind. Something smaller, more deliberate. He turned the key in the lock. It clicked, then resisted, then gave. The door swung inward with a reluctant moan, revealing a hall cloaked in shadow. The smell hit him immediately. Dust would rot, and something beneath it all, something sour and unfamiliar. Jonas stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The hallway stretched deep into the dark. A staircase climbed to the second floor at the far end, its steps thin and warped. His flashlight cut a narrow cone through the gloom. Portraits lined the walls, all turned slightly askew. Faces, blurred by time and grime, stared at him from behind cracked glass. None of them he recognized. They weren't his family. Or if they were too old to recall. Men in stiff collars and women with hollow eyes, dresses like shadows spilling from their shoulders. As he passed, one of the portraits clicked softly in its frame. He turned. Stillness. Just a creak of floorboards under his own feet. The faint drip of water somewhere far off in plumbing, and a distant moan of the wind outside. But something about the way the house held sound, how it seemed to stretch it just a second too long, made him feel as though something was listening back. He explored slowly, boots echoing in the empty space. Dust blanketed the parlor and library, and he could see signs of rodent activity in corners, dropping shredded insulation, claw marks along the trim. Yet for all its decay, the house didn't feel truly abandoned, not in the way he expected. There were no signs of vandalism, no graffiti, no broken furniture or teenage beer bottles. Everything was preserved, as if someone had been watching over it. Or worse, living here quietly for years, leaving just enough evidence behind to avoid attention. At the end of the main hallway, he found a locked door, heavy, iron riveted, not like the others. It had no knob, just a smooth, keyless space flush with the wood. Something about it gave him pause. The air felt colder the closer he stood to it. Not cold like a draft. Cold like something inert, sealed away too long. He stood there longer than he meant to. Eventually, he turned away and went to find the upstairs bedrooms. The second floor groaned underfoot as he climbed. The fog outside had grown thicker, pressing against the windows like cotton packed behind glass. From one window, he could barely make out the road. The trees stood unmoving, black and towering, their outlines smudged by mist. He picked the least mold-ridden bedroom and set his bags by the old dresser. The bed was hard, its frame sunken on one side, but the sheets, though yellowed, were dry. He sat on the edge, listening to the silence. That was when he heard it, a faint shuffling from the first floor. Light, deliberate, moving toward the stairs. He stood slowly. The sound stopped. The wind picked up for a moment, then died again. He walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. The hall below was empty, but the locked door was open, only an inch. Jonas didn't move at first. He stood at the top of the stairs, one hand on the banister, staring down at the door he knew. He was sure, had been sealed. Not just locked, but completely shut without a knob or any visible mechanism. Now it hung open, just slightly, but that sliver was enough to see the absence beyond it. The darkness inside wasn't like the rest of the house. This wasn't dust and decay. This was absence. An unlit well dug into the center of a dream. His flashlight barely pushed into it. It was like shining a beam into an oil slick. He descended the steps slowly, boots muffled by the thickening silence. The air changed again. He hadn't noticed until then how damp it had been before, how oppressive the fog had made the air inside feel. Now, the atmosphere in the house turned dry, bone dry. His throat scratched. The skin on his lips tightened. He swallowed, but it didn't help. As he reached the bottom step, he instinctively pressed a hand against his chest, trying to steady his breath. The open door stood just ahead. He reached out. His hand hesitated inches from the wood. The grain was dark and warped, almost fluid under the shifting light. The room beyond a crack was utterly silent. A silence so complete that it seemed to pull the sounds around it. Even the tick of the old grandfather clock near the parlor had faded. Jonas pushed the door wider. It opened without a sound. The room was narrow, longer than it was wide, with walls made of the same stone as the foundation. The air had no scent. It didn't move. The light from his flashlight barely penetrated more than a few feet before it dissolved into the waiting dark. Dust hung in thick bands, but didn't shift when he stepped inside. There were no cobwebs, no insects, just stone and dark. The beam of light caught on something metal near the far end of the room, a chair, and in it a figure. Jonas froze. The figure wasn't moving, at least not at first. It was a mannequin. That's what he told himself. It had to be. But as he stepped closer, each detail felt more precise than a mannequin should allow. The yellowed folds of skin, the shape of the fingernails, the stringy remnants of hair along the scalp. It sat facing the far wall, its hands resting on its knees, head slightly bowed, wearing a thin, moth-eaten robe. The flashlight glinted off small, dark eyes that may have once been human, but now held no reflection. And that's when Jonas noticed the carvings. All around the room, shallow patterns had been etched into the stone, rows of half-legible runes, curling vines that weren't decorative but purposeful, like diagrams or instructions, symbols that twisted his stomach when he tried to follow their meanings. At the figure's feet was a small, circular depression in the stone. It looked too deliberate to be damaged. The mannequin, or whatever it was, had something clenched in its hand. Jonas knelt slowly and peered closer. A key, rusty, ancient, but unmistakably a key. Long, thin, and iron. He didn't want to touch it, but he knew he would. He reached forward and, with slow precision, began to slide the key from the figure's hand. Its fingers closed around his. Jonas screamed and staggered backward, knocking over a chair behind him with a crash that seemed to shake the room. The figure didn't move again. The hand had frozen in its new position, as if it had never moved at all. He stared at it for a long time, chest heaving, flashlight trembling in his grip. The key was still there, still mostly exposed. Finally, he stepped forward again, gritting his teeth, and snatched it free. The figure did not react. He turned and backed toward the door. But the door was closed. Not just shut, sealed again. The frame flush and smooth, no sign it had ever opened. The walls of the room seemed to press closer, the ceiling bending slightly inward, stone groaning in the deep. Then came the sound. It wasn't from the door. It wasn't from the figure. It came from the floor beneath him, a soft, gurgling breath, like water filling lungs. The breath did not repeat, but Jonas was sure he had heard it. Not imagined, heard. The unmistakable sound of moisture drawn through something soft and living. Then it had vanished, leaving the air impossibly dry again, as if the sound had stolen every last trace of humidity from the room. He backed away from the sealed door, heart hammering in his ribs like something desperate to get out. His flashlight flickered, not out of battery. Jonas had charged it that morning before leaving home, but like it was struggling to illuminate what it touched. The light became murky near the walls, swallowed into the carvings, smothered by their curling depths. The floor beneath him was smooth stone, but it pulsed faintly, as if something just beneath it shifted, stirred, breathed again. Not real, he muttered to himself. It's stress. Long drive, no sleep. That's all. The moment he said it, something in the wall directly behind him gave a low, wet creak. He whirled. The carvings had deepened. That was the only way he could describe it. As if, in the brief seconds he had looked away, the runes had sunk farther into stone, curling at the edges, hungry, and there, where the wall met the floor, movement. At first, he thought it was just a spider, but no spider moved like that. It wasn't walking, it was sliding, pulling itself forward in a way that reminded him of time-lapse footage of vines growing. It had too many legs, then not enough, then too many again, a shape undefined by nature, crawling from a crack in the stone as if it had been gestating for centuries. He stumbled away from it and kicked the wall. The sealed door didn't move, but the mannequin turned. It didn't creak. It didn't shift with slow, ponderous motion. Its head simply turned, from one position to another like a thought being revised. The eyes, though empty, were open now, fully, and they were watching him. The mouth followed, a slow, wet peeling open of the lips, the sound of dry meat splitting. From its throat came a sound, not words, not even a growl, just a low, open-mouthed intake, like the gasp of something long forgotten trying to breathe once more. Jonas turned and slammed his shoulder against the door. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. He hammered it with a flashlight, the beam flailing wildly across the stone as he turned back toward the center of the room, and froze. The creature that had been crawling from the wall had grown. Its limbs were longer now. It was halfway up the side of the wall, dragging itself along the carvings, smearing something dark as it moved. Its skin was glassy and pale, and its face, a loose, pulpy fold of lips and sockets, looked human, but only in the vaguest, most unfortunate sense. Jonas gripped the key tighter. It dug into his palm, and that's when he realized something else. The key was warm. It pulsed. It beat like a second heart in his hand. As he held it, the door behind him clicked. Not swung open, just clicked, a small sound. But in the vacuum of that sealed stone room, it was louder than thunder. He didn't look back. He ran. The door had formed an edge, still sealed, still without a handle, but now a narrow vertical seam broke the wall's pattern. He touched the key to the seam. The stone peeled open like paper under fire, folding back into nothingness, revealing the hallway once more, washed in the muddy yellow glow of his lantern, which still sat undisturbed on the table near the stairs. He didn't question it. He ran through. The door sealed behind him with a sound that wasn't mechanical, wasn't physical. It was internal, as if it had closed somewhere inside his mind. He collapsed on the hallway floor, heart hammering, chest heaving. No breath now, no figures, just a lamp buzzing quietly, casting shadows on the old wallpaper. But in his clenched fist, the key still pulsed, and in the silence, something distant and wet whispered his name. Jonas didn't sleep that night. He tried, curling on the floor just beneath the staircase, wrapped in his coat, the key still clutched in one trembling hand. But every time his eyes fluttered closed, he heard it, a faint ticking, not from the lantern or the bones of the old house. This was deeper, embedded within the walls, behind the plaster and the old wooden studs, like the hollow rhythm of a clock, only imperfect, not mechanical, biological. It seemed to follow a pattern, one that grew more insistent the longer he listened, a ticking with pauses, double beats, longer intervals, like a code or a heartbeat. When the morning sun finally poured through the warped curtains, it did nothing to banish the sense of watching that clung to him like cobwebs. Wicklow House remained mute, the same silence, the same cold, the same stench beneath everything. He made coffee. The old electric kettle still worked. Somewhere in the house, the faint sound of water moving through ancient pipes groaned like a throat struggling to swallow. The ticking was quieter now, but still there, under the floorboards, in the corner of the kitchen, behind the oven. It was everywhere. The key hadn't changed. It still pulsed, still radiated a low warmth. though it no longer beat in rhythm with his heart. It had its own cadence now, slower, more thoughtful, like it was waiting. He didn't know why he hadn't left, why he hadn't flung the key into the trees and taken off down the road. But the truth pulsed inside him, as steady as a key. The house wouldn't let him. He could walk out the front door. He could, but he wouldn't get far. And even if he did, whatever had awakened in the depths of Wicklow House had already slipped inside him. By noon, he gave up the pretense of rest and began to explore the house again. He returned to the hallway, tracing its length slowly. The lantern still sat where he'd left it, the glow now long extinguished, the glass fogged over. He stepped past it. The wall where the secret door had been was once again seamless. He pressed his ear to it. Nothing. But as he turned to leave, he caught something on the edge of his vision, just a flicker near the baseboard. He bent down. There, etched into the wooden floor where he'd knelt the night before, was a shape, a circle, maybe 6 inches wide, made of crude scratches like something clawed into the wood. No, not a shape, a sigil, and in its center, a droplet of something black and glossy trembled on the edge of stillness. Jonas knelt slowly, unsure if he even wanted to see it more clearly. The droplet shimmered. It didn't reflect the room or his face or the light overhead. It reflected something else entirely. Stone, cold and slick and ancient. A reflection of downward. A pit without bottom. A door. The sigil pulsed. The same rhythm as the key. Without thinking, Jonas held the key above the sigil. The metal vibrated faintly. The droplet quivered, and then the ticking in the walls stopped. All of it, at once. The house held its breath. The key grew cold. Behind Jonas, a creak echoed up the stairs. Not a footstep exactly, but a shift, a repositioning. Like something had been standing very still for a very long time, and had just remembered it had legs. Jonas stood slowly. The stairs were empty. No shadows, no shapes, but he could feel it. Something upstairs had woken. He took a step toward the staircase, and the lantern sputtered. No flame, just a pulse of light, a warning. Then the creak again, closer now. Jonas backed away and turned toward the kitchen, anywhere but up. But when he entered the hall again, he froze. The kitchen was gone, not vanished, but changed. The wallpaper had peeled back in long vertical strips, revealing ancient stone beneath. Moss and lichen clung to the corners. The ceiling bowed with moisture. The scent of earth and rust and something older than rot flooded the air. This wasn't the kitchen. This wasn't the house. This was the inside. Somewhere, the ticking resumed, but it wasn't the walls anymore. It was inside him. Jonas stood on the threshold of what used to be the kitchen. What now spread before him was a room submerged in dampness. Darkness pressing in from the corners like a hell breath. Moss grew up the legs of what used to be a dining table. The walls, slick with condensation, glistened like the inside of the throat. There was no sign of a stove, no countertops, no sink. Just a vague skeletal remnants of what those things might have once been, half to just about a house. He took a step forward. The floor let out a groan, not the creak of aging wood, but the complaint of something alive, something burdened. The planks sank slightly beneath his feet, and he thought for a moment that they might give way. He lifted his foot slowly, and for a second saw it, a film, not water, thicker, membranous. There was something new on the far wall, a window. He could have sworn it hadn't been there before. It was small, square like a porthole, and pale light shone through it, sickly and filtered. But the strangest thing wasn't the light. It was the fact that it looked into nothing. Not outside, not a garden or the street, not even another room. Just pale gray, like fog or skin. He approached it slowly, step by slow, careful step. His breath fogged the air now. It was cold in here, far colder than it had any right to be. The moss under his boots crackled slightly, damp but brittle. He stood before the pale window. The surface wasn't glass. It was flesh-like, smooth but porous, veined faintly like the thin skin beneath an eyelid. As he leaned in closer, trying to understand what it truly was, it pulsed, a gentle rise and fall, like breath, and then it opened, not outward, not inward. It dilated. The pale surface constricted, then dilated like a pupil, slow and organic, and something shifted behind it. A form, not solid, not truly separate, just present, watching. It didn't move closer. It didn't need to. The second Jonas met its gaze, if it even had one, he felt the pressure behind his eyes, like fingers slipping beneath the sockets. Not pain, not quite, curiosity. It studied him, and he studied it. And in that moment he understood. The house had not brought him here to haunt him. It had not lured him with childhood nightmares or grief. It had brought him to see, to be seen. Behind the window, something vast uncoiled. Limbs? Thoughts? He couldn't say. But it wasn't separate from the house. It was the house, or had become it. A low groan echoed up from the boards beneath his feet. He backed away instinctively, and the pale window closed slowly, sealing once again into a patch of wall that was no longer flesh but old, stained plaster. Everything went still, and the ticking stopped again, but not because it had ended, because something was listening. Jonas turned and fled from the room, stumbling back into the hallway, breath catching in his throat. But it wasn't the same hallway anymore. The photographs were gone. The walls were smooth. Only a mirror remained, full-length, ancient, and framed in iron. And in the mirror, Jonas did not see himself. He saw the boy he once was, alone, standing barefoot in the orchard, staring at the house. His lips moved, but there was no sound, except the ticking. And behind it, a whisper nearly drowned. Do you remember now? The mirror held him, Jonas as a boy, longer than felt reasonable, not just as a reflection, but as an echo across time. His younger self's mouth moved again, slower this time, like it struggled against water. There were no words, no sound, just that strange dragging of lips over syllables that refused to form. And then, the mirror flickered. Jonas blinked. Now the boy was gone. In his place stood nothing, not a reflection, not a distortion, nothing at all. The mirror had become a window into a place that refused to be seen. It was as if the glass had given up, unable to translate what stood before it. Behind the absence, something rippled faintly, too distant to perceive but too close to ignore. The ticking began again, faster this time, layered like overlapping clocks out of sync. Jonas stepped back, stomach cold, his throat aching with unshed breath. A new door appeared at the end of the hall. It hadn't been there before. He would have noticed it. The frame was ancient and warped, and the door itself lacked a handle. Instead, it had an indentation, shaped like a hand. Not a knob, not a keyhole, just a suggestion of a touch. Jonas knew better. He should turn back. He should leave this place and never return. But the logic of the Wicklow house didn't align with anything that made sense. The front door would be gone. The windows walled. He was inside now, and it had accepted him. His fingers trembled as he reached toward the indentation. The moment his palm met the shape, it sank inward with a wet sigh, the texture beneath his skin warm and beating. A heartbeat. The door opened soundlessly. Inside, the air smelled like ink and decay. This was no ordinary room. There were no walls, just curtains, thousands of them, tall and thin, hanging from what seemed to be an endless black void above. They stirred faintly in a breeze that came from nowhere, all of them the same color, that same pale, almost flesh tone of the window from before. Jonas stepped through, each step muffled by a thick, damp carpet. The silence here was denser. It swallowed even the ticking. As he brushed against one of the curtains, it recoiled, not like fabric, but like something alive startled from sleep. He froze. There were whispers behind them, not voices, thoughts, shuffling dreams trapped in seams. Then movement. To his right, one of the curtains shifted, the shape behind it bulging toward him. A form pressed against a thin veil. No face, no name. Just the silhouette of a person whose identity had been scraped clean. Its head tilted. Jonas held his breath. It tilted further. Its fingers reached toward the curtain, pushing at the membrane. And slowly, so slowly, it began to peel the curtain aside. Jonas stepped back instinctively. But the curtain beside him now rippled too. Then another, and another. They were all waking up. He turned, but the door was gone, where he had entered. There was only more curtain, draped in folds of ancient weight. One of them whispered his name. Not Jonas. Joey, his childhood nickname. The voice was his mother's, but it came from too low, too cold. He reached for a curtain, not to open it, but to steady himself. But the moment his fingers touched it, they stuck. Not with glue or moisture, but with memory. A memory that wasn't his. A child's laughter turned to screams. A garden full of dolls with broken eyes. A bed with no sheets, only roots. He tore his hand free, skin burning. From deeper within the endless chamber of curtains came the unmistakable sound of something large rising to its feet. Not on two legs. Not in haste. It had been waiting. Jonas ran. But wherever he ran, the curtains closed in again, always just far enough to allow movement, never wide enough to show a path. Then, just as he was sure he would fall and scream and lose his mind, a light appeared ahead. A door, not a strange one, not like the rest. A plain, white-painted door, chipped at the corners, a brass handle, his childhood bedroom door. He lunged toward it. Behind him, the curtains shrieked as they tore themselves open, and the thing that had risen gave chase, fast and silent. Jonas gripped the handle, turned it, and dove inside. Slamming it shut, he collapsed on soft carpet, gasping. He was in his old room, the one from age 9, the plaid bed sheets, the crooked poster of Saturn, the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling. Everything was perfect, except for the shadow beneath the door. It hadn't followed him in, but it was waiting. It knew this room too, and it was patient. The room was too quiet. Jonas sat on the old carpet, breathing like a hunted thing, hands trembling against his knees. Everything around him remained still. His childhood bed untouched, the dresser where he once kept his crayon box, even the small gouge in the floorboard from when he tripped chasing the cat. It was all there, perfectly recreated down to the dustless sheen on the desk's corner. But that wasn't right. There had always been dust. His mother had called it your little weather system, always nagging to clean, to wipe, to sweep. This was not a place frozen in time. It was a place restored, curated by something that remembered far too much. The air was thick with the scent of old cedar and mothballs. It pressed against the skin like velvet soaked in glue. Outside the door, that shadow waited, its edges unmoving, but its presence unmistakable. It didn't shift like a person. It seeped slow and patient, like oil across tile. It had no form, only hunger. He stood and tried the window, knowing it would be locked but needing to confirm it. It was open. The breeze that crept through was not from the Wicklow forest. It was heavier, souter. There was a sound in the distance, not wind in trees, but the dull, resonant throb of waves against stone. Sea air, impossibly far from where the house should be. He pushed the window further, leaned out. A cliff's edge stared back at him, steep and sharp, wrapped in a fog that breathed like lungs. A single stone path wound downward toward what looked like. He blinked. A pier? No. A dock, with a small boat and a light. Someone, something, stood by the lamp hunched unmoving, too far to see clearly, but not too far to feel its attention. Jonas withdrew fast, heart thumping. Behind him, the floor creaked. He spun. Nothing, but the air had changed. It smelled like something had entered. Something wet. The posters on the wall rippled, ever so slightly. He backed toward the bed and sat down carefully, unwilling to take his eyes off the room. It still looked the same, but something was different. The edges of objects began to fuzz, colors dimming, like the whole space was losing its place in the world. Then, the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. No knocking, no rattling, just a steady, clockwise rotation that moved with the surety of a hand that had done this 1,000 times before. Jonas stood, but didn't approach. The knob turned until it clicked, and then turned back, resetting. A moment later, it turned again. Click, reset, click, reset. The rhythm was maddening. like a lullaby written by someone who had never heard music, but had spent lifetimes trying to remember it. Jonas crept to the closet and opened it, half expecting to find a hidden passage or some malformed child hiding within. But it was empty. No, not quite. On the back wall, something was scratched into the wood. Long, looping letters, carved shallow but deliberate. When the night pours, and do not open your mouth. Jonas reached up and ran a finger across the letters. They were warm to the touch. A hum filled the room, not from outside, not from the door, from above. He looked up. The glow-in-the-dark stars were falling, one by one, silently peeling away and drifting down like ash. They didn't fall straight. They wavered, as if through water, and the ceiling was no longer a ceiling. It was darkening, dimming into a thick gray swirl. Clouds, low, close, pressing against the roof of the room. And then the rain began. Not water, but shadows. Darkness poured down in rivulets that splashed silently on the carpet, spreading without soaking, crawling like ink toward his feet. Jonas stumbled back, slapping the closet door shut behind him, his breath hitching. Outside the bedroom door, the handle stopped turning. Something heavy leaned against the wood. Then it spoke, a voice without vowels, just the intention of sound, not in language, not in words, but in dreams. The dreams he used to have as a child, about the man with the bird mask who lived under the house, the one who only came when the wind turned red. The voice pressed into his head, soft and intimate. Let me help you remember. Jonas screamed, and the stars exploded, raining plastic and static across the room. Then, silence. The door slowly creaked open, and the room filled with wind that did not blow. Jonas didn't run. There was nowhere to run. He stood rooted to the carpet as the door to his childhood bedroom creaked open, revealing not the hallway he remembered, but a yawning absence of place, a corridor swallowed by ink and static, as though the world beyond had been erased and replaced with a memory of something unfinished. The wind that poured in was silent. It did not rustle the sheets, did not stir the curtains. It moved through things instead of around them, coiling through bones of the room like a breath exhaled from another time. It passed through Jonas, and for a moment he forgot where he was, who he was. He felt young. He felt old. A child crouched in a closet, and an old man dying in a field. Both versions of himself holding hands with nothing. And then it was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that was not silent, but waiting. The hallway outside stretched in impossible directions, its shapes shimmering as though underwater. The walls were papered in layers of memory, photographs half-formed, wallpaper from other decades, doorways that didn't match. The light was gray and colorless, bleeding into itself with no source, no sun. He took a step forward and heard no sound. Another, still nothing. No footsteps, no creaks, not even his breath. It was as if the air had been removed, and in its place was a substance that did not allow sound to survive. He turned back toward his room. It was gone, not just a room. The door, the entire wall was seamless, smooth as polished stone. No seams, no edges, no way back. A child's whisper brushed his ear. Don't go down. Jonas spun, but the hallway remained empty. More steps, a bend to the left. Then another. Each turned open into more of the same. Gray walls, impossible architecture. At one point, he passed a window that looked out over nothing. A void, like standing at the edge of the world with no sky, no ground. Just absence. He kept moving. There were doors, eventually, closed ones. Each looked older than the last. Some bore signs of weathering. Moss along the base, rusted hinges. Paint peeled to wood. Others looked untouched, but wrong in shape or size. One was no taller than his chest. Another stretched into the ceiling, its knob placed absurdly high, unreachable. He stopped at a door that pulsed faintly, not with light, but with feeling. He pressed his palm against it, warm. It felt like skin beneath old paint. He turned the knob. The room inside was lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from a wire that vanished into the ceiling. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds, maybe thousands, each nailed in place. Some were blurry, others too sharp. All of them featured the same house. Wicklow House. Sometimes in daylight, sometimes in storm. One photo near the far corner showed it burning. He moved closer. In the image, the flames didn't spread normally. They curled upward in thick spirals, like reverse smoke, retreating into the sky rather than rising. He touched the image, and suddenly he was there, standing outside the house as it burned. The sky overhead churned with black and red clouds. The windows were full of faces, pressed against the glass like wet paper. Not screaming, just watching. Silent. He couldn't move, not even his fingers. Then a shape stepped through the fire, not from inside, but through, as if the flames were a curtain, not a barrier. It was tall, wrapped in something like seaweed or velvet, dragging across the grass with a wet hiss. Its face was a blur, as if he were looking through condensation, and it moved toward him with a slowness that suggested it didn't need to hurry. Jonas tried to speak, to beg, to wake, but he had no mouth. The shape reached him and raised a hand, not to strike, to show, its palm open, and inside was a small black stone, pulsing like a heart. Carved into it was a sigil, a perfect spiral broken in one place. A symbol Jonas had seen before, in a dream, in a fever, in the wallpaper when he was 6. The figure pressed the stone to his chest, and he woke, back in a room of photos. The bulb above him spun slowly now, its flicker rhythmic. The door behind him had closed, but this time it had a mirror. He looked, and for the first time in his life, Jonas didn't recognize the face staring back. It wore his skin, but it smiled without lips, and its eyes, they were dripping. The smile lingered in the mirror even after Jonas turned away. He pressed his back against the cool surface of the door, his heart clawing at his ribs like something trapped. The walls in this room didn't hum, didn't breathe, but they held a pressure as the air had grown heavy, denser with every photograph surrounding him. The silence was no longer empty. It was watchful. One photograph near the floor had changed. It now showed the room he stood in, not as it was, but as it would be. The photographs were rotted. The light bulb had burst, replaced with dangling wires. And in the corner, where no one stood now, was a figure kneeling, not moving, not facing the camera. A blur, like someone halfway through the process of being remembered. Jonas reached down to touch the photo, then hesitated. Instead, he turned to the door and opened it. This hallway was different. Not brighter, not warmer, just more confined. The ceiling had lowered to an uncomfortable height, and the walls pressed close, draped in a dark, greasy fabric that clung to his shoulders when he moved. It had a smell like old soap and wet wool. The floor creaked beneath each step, not like wood, but like ribs under weight. Jonas didn't stop. He couldn't afford to anymore. The further he went, the more he realized he lost any sense of direction. The concept of upstairs or basement had vanished. The Wicklow house was no longer playing by the rules of geometry or gravity. It breathed in directions that didn't exist. He paused at a wall that seemed softer than the others. A patch of cloth bulged slightly. He pressed his hand to it, and something moved on the other side. He stumbled back as the wall twitched, like the stretch of skin over something trying to escape. A muffled fluttering noise followed, rapid and wet, like wings beating against flesh. Then silence again. He leaned in and heard it, whispering. Not words, just a suggestion of mouths. A skittering language older than language. His skin broke into goose flesh. The fabric thinned beneath his breath, and for a moment, he thought he saw an eye watching him, lambent, cloudy, human. He fled. The corridor bled into another doorway. This one bore no knob, no handle, just a vertical slit like a curtain or throat. He stepped through and emerged into what must have once been a dining room. A long table stood beneath a chandelier of melted glass, warped and useless. Chairs had been turned upside down, legs splintered. At the end of the table sat a girl. Her back was to him, pale arms folded in her lap. Her black hair hung like drapery. "Do you remember me?" she asked without turning. Jonas said nothing. He didn't recognize the voice, but it stirred something beneath his ribs, a memory malformed by time and fear. "Everyone forgets," she continued, That's the first price. They come in with names and leave with shadows, but you stayed too long. She lifted her hand and pointed to a crack in the far wall. You buried something. Behind that, years ago, before the fever dream, before the water. Jonas moved to the wall, slowly, as though obeying her voice was more instinct than choice. His fingers traced a crack, pried at it. It gave way with a sigh, revealing a recess no larger than a shoebox. Inside lay a bundle of cloth. He pulled it out, unwrapped, a dead bird, mummified, wrapped in the same kind of gauze that hung in the hallway. Its wings had been carefully stitched shut with red thread. A symbol was scrawled beneath it in faded chalk, a spiral broken at the curve. He stepped back. "I don't understand," he whispered. The girl at the table began to hum. A lullaby, one he hadn't heard in 20 years. From when he was sick, from when the house kept him for 7 days straight. And no doctor could explain why he woke up stronger. The stitches on the bird's wings unraveled slowly. The body twitched. Jonas dropped it, and the thing flopped once, then stilled. The humming stopped. The girl was no longer at the table, but he hadn't seen her leave. Only then did he realize. The chandelier above him was moving. It wasn't made of glass. It was made of moths. Hundreds of them, clinging to one another in the shape of a chandelier, pulsing in and out like a living lung. One by one, they peeled from the mass and took flight, spiraling toward the walls, dissolving into fabric, vanishing into the architecture. Their wings brushed his ears like tiny breaths, and as they passed, each whisper spoke his name. Not Jonas, not anymore, the name he'd forgotten long ago. And as the last moth faded into the wall, he remembered everything. The name echoed long after the moths disappeared, but Jonas couldn't speak it aloud. Not yet. It sat behind his teeth like something bitter and rusted, as if his mouth had forgotten how to shape it properly. The air had changed again. Not colder, but stiller. Even the low, constant breath of the house had paused, as though listening. He turned back toward the recess in the wall. The bird's body was gone, not simply moved or taken, but unwritten. The chalk spiral scoured clean. The cloth bundle disintegrated into a fine ash that clung to his fingertips. Only the smell remained, dry blood and mildew. And then a door opened. It didn't creak. It didn't groan. It just was open now, where before there had only been wallpaper and rotted molding. A perfect rectangle carved into the impossible geometry of the house, lightless and soundless, and lined with jagged, half-buried nails like teeth. Its hinges weren't visible, but it didn't seem to need them. It had never needed to be built. It had always been. Jonas stepped closer. Something moved inside. Not a person, not a shadow, a presence, broad and low, pressing outward like a tide trying to force its way through a crack in a dam. He felt it before he heard it. The hum, not of moth wings now, but a breath, deep and slow and resonant enough to tremble his ribs. He reached his hand into the doorway. It went numb past the wrist. A soft, suctioning pressure wrapped around his skin, like something pulling him inward, not violently, not urgently, just persistently, as if it had always intended for him to come back, as if this were not the first time. And then came the whisper again, this time not from inside, but behind him. He turned. The room was gone. In its place, a corridor long, uneven, cluttered with doors on either side. Each bore a brass plate etched with words and languages he could not read. Some of them were upside down, others reversed, mirrored, inverted. Some plates had been scratched so deeply that blood seemed to beat along the grooves. Only one door stood slightly ajar. It breathed. He approached it like prey, each footfall deliberate. The door itself was different from the others. It had no handle, no hinges. It pulsed with a quiet rhythm, almost biological. Flesh-like, though still wooden to the touch. The surface was carved, not with symbols, but with small faces. Each face was his own. Mouths open, eyes blank, hair matted with a rot that hadn't yet happened. He pushed the door. It did not open outward. It opened inward into him, and the world changed. He stood in his childhood bedroom. The wallpaper peeled in the same spiral shapes he'd found beneath the bird. The window was cracked the same way it had been after the storm, the one his parents had insisted never happened. Outside the window, the orchard looked untouched by time. No overgrowth, no rot, just perfect, symmetrical rows of trees stretching to the edge of a fog-thick horizon. On the bed lay a small box. Jonas sat beside it. The sheets had the same pattern. Sailing ships caught in a frozen tide. He'd hated that pattern. He remembered tracing the outlines during nights when the house fell off, when the hallway lights flickered for no reason, when the attic door clicked open at 3:13 a.m. every night for a week. He opened the box. Inside were teeth, not his own. Too many, too long, too narrow. They were warm, nestled in velvet that seemed to sigh as he moved them aside, uncovering a letter folded thrice, tied with red thread. The same thread that had bound the bird's wings. The same thread, now looped tightly around his right wrist. The thread hadn't been there before. He untied the letter and read, "To the one who has forgotten way out. You were the first, and you will be the last. Memory is the prison. The house is the guard. Every step forward is a step inward. When you reach the center, bury your name. Only then can the house sleep." Jonas dropped the letter. Outside the window, the orchard had begun to burn. No flame, no smoke, just a collapse of shape and structure. Trees bending impossibly backward, roots writhing like snakes, the soil fracturing like old parchment. The fog consumed it all, and within that fog, eyes blinked open. He stepped away from the bed, only to find himself stepping into the corridor again, back through the door, back into the hum. It had tricked him again. No matter how many rooms he found, they would all lead to this, the mouth of the house, and somewhere deeper still, past the spiral halls and whispering walls. The center waited, still breathing, still dreaming, still remembering him. Jonas found himself once more in the corridor, a place that felt both new and ancient, like a wound that had never healed but refused to close. The air here was thick with dust and the scent of old paper and decay. The walls pulsed with a rhythm not unlike his own heartbeat, but slower and heavier, as though time itself was dragging its feet through this corridor. The photographs had multiplied, now plastered along every inch of wall, overlapping in layers like peeling skin. Faces stared back at him, some familiar, some distorted beyond recognition. The eyes in each picture seemed to shift as he moved, watching with a cold patience. At the far end of the hallway, a spiral staircase descended into darkness. The steps were uneven, worn smooth by countless feet that had long since vanished. The air grew colder the closer he approached, the silence thickening until it was almost suffocating. As Jonas placed a foot on the first step, a low whisper began to crawl through the walls. It was unintelligible at first, just a breath, a rustle, but it grew louder with each step downward. Words began to form, broken fragments of sentences in a language that twisted and turned on itself. He felt the meaning rather than heard it. Words like remember, forget, return, and release wrapped around him like chains. He continued, his hand trailing along the railing, though it slick and warm beneath his fingers. The spiral seemed endless, but his legs kept moving, compelled by something beyond will. Halfway down, the stairs opened into a cavernous room carved directly from stone. In its center stood a towering pillar, spiral with the same sigil that had appeared throughout the house. The broken spiral. It thrummed with a dull red glow, pulsing in time with the whispering voices. Jonas stepped closer, feeling the heat radiate from the pillar. The whispers crescendoed, overlapping into a chorus that pushed against his mind. Suddenly, the pillar's surface shifted, like water disturbed by a stone, and the glow intensified. Faces appeared within it, twisting and writhing, mouths opening in silent screams. The eyes locked onto Jonas, their gazes piercing through his soul. A voice louder than the rest echoed inside his head. "You cannot escape what you are." Jonas stumbled backward, but the floor beneath him gave way. He fell, not down, but inward, as if gravity had reversed. The pillar's glow consumed him, wrapping him in its spiraled embrace. Darkness swallowed him whole, and in that darkness, he heard the final whisper. Remember to forget, forget to remember. Jonas's fall through darkness stretched beyond reason, as if he were suspended in an abyss without bottom or edge. The silence was absolute, deafening in its completeness. His limbs floated free, untethered from gravity or time, but his mind raced, desperate to grasp meaning or memory. Slowly, a faint pulse returned. Not light, not sound, but sensation. A hollow breath, like the sigh of a cavern deep beneath the earth. It moved through him, cold and slow, hollow and alive. He opened his eyes. He was no longer falling. He stood in a vast hollow chamber, carved from bone-white stone, smooth and cold. The walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing in unison with him. Here, no photos or doors existed, only the hollow breath that circled endlessly. Ahead, a single figure waited, not solid, not flesh, but made of shifting shadows and flickering light. Its form was human-shaped, but incomplete, missing edges, blurring and reassembling in patterns like smoke caught in a draft. It moved with fluid grace, and when it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind over broken glass. "You have come far," it said, "but this is not the end." Jonas stepped forward, feeling the pulse of the chamber sinking with his own heartbeat. "What is this place?" he asked, voice barely more than a whisper. "The heart," the figure said, "the wound beneath the house. The memory of all who have entered, all who have been lost. The place where forgetting is impossible and remembering is a curse." Jonas looked down. His hands were pale and trembling. The key burned in his palm, warm and steady. A beak in the endless hollow. "Why am I here?" "To find the center," the figure replied. "To bury your name. To close the spiral. To give the house rest." Jonas swallowed. "How?" The figure extended a shadowy hand, and a thin thread appeared, red and glowing, the same as the one binding his wrist. "Follow the thread," it said. "But beware. Each step takes you deeper into yourself, and the house watches all." Jonas took the thread, feeling it pulse with life. He began to walk. Behind him, the hollow breath grew louder, echoing with voices he recognized and others that belonged only to the night. He was not alone, and the house was not done with him yet. Jonas followed the glowing red thread as it stretched taut before him, weaving through the vast white chamber like a lifeline in a sea of nothingness. Each step was cautious, his feet barely touching the smooth floor, echoing faintly in the void. The thread pulsed softly, warm against the skin, but with every heartbeat it seemed to pull him forward, deeper into the labyrinth of his own memories. Around him, shadows flickered at the edges of vision, half-formed faces, whispers without names, echoes of forgotten promises and broken dreams. The air tasted of ash and cold metal, heavy with the weight of things best left undisturbed. Jonas's breath came shallow, the silence thickening as the red line led him further away from light and hope. He came to a spiral staircase carved into floor, descending into darkness coiled like a serpent's tail. The thread wound tightly around the handrail, guiding him down step by uneven step. The walls here breathed, softly contracting and expanding as if alive, whispering secrets in a language older than time. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a chamber where the walls were covered in ink-black spirals that writhed and shifted under his gaze. The broken spiral, the same symbol from the bird's wings, the doors, carvings, the photographs, was etched in endless repetition, each one bleeding shadows that stretched toward him like grasping fingers. Jonas's skin crawled. He pressed his palm to the nearest spiral and felt the cold seep beneath his flesh, tendrils of darkness winding their way into his veins. A voice hummed beneath the surface of his mind, a chorus of forgotten selves murmuring warnings and pleas. Remember to forget, forget to remember. His heart raced, and for a moment he saw a door appear before him, small and simple, framed in white. The red thread disappeared into its keyhole. With trembling fingers, Jonas turned the key, and the door swung open inward once more. Beyond it lay a room of mirrors, not ordinary mirrors, but fragmented shards hung haphazardly, each reflecting a different part of him. His face aged, his body twisted, his eyes empty. The reflections whispered and moved independently, reciting fragments of his life in voices distorted and broken. Jonas stepped inside, the red thread now a fine line of smoke curling around his ankles. The mirrors shifted, closing in, reflecting not just his image but his fears, his regrets, and the parts of himself he had tried to bury. He knew then. The center was not a place but a confrontation with himself, a reckoning. As the shards pressed closer, the house held its breath, and Jonas prepared to face what had waited for him all along. The room of mirrors closed around Jonas, each shard catching fragments of his soul, splintering his reflection into countless broken pieces. He tried to look away, but the fragments whispered, softly at first, then louder, chanting his name in a chorus of voices, some familiar, others twisted beyond recognition. They echoed memories he had buried deep. Childhood fears, lost loves, betrayals both given and received. He reached out, fingertips brushing a mirror shard that reflected a younger version of himself, eyes wide with innocence and terror. The image blinked and smiled sadly, mouthing words Jonas could almost hear. "You forgot." Another shard showed the man he had become, hardened, cautious, hollowed out by years of silence and shadow. That reflection laugh, a dry, cracked sound that felt like a knife against Jonas's ribs. The mirrors began to shift, swirling their surfaces like liquid glass, drawing Jonas into a vortex of memory and identity. Time fractured, past, present, and future collapsed into a single, twisting spiral. Faces appeared, his family, strangers, the girl at the table, the faceless shadow from the corridor, all merging into one indistinct mass. He staggered back, the shards multiplying, their voices rising a crescendo of torment and longing. The red thread pulsed wildly, wrapping tighter around his wrist, tethering him to the center. A sudden silence fell. One shard remained before him, a perfect, clear mirror reflecting a single eye, his own, but the pupil was a spiral, slowly turning inward, pulling him deeper into himself. Jonas understood. To bury his name, to close the spiral, he must surrender, not to the house, but to himself, the fractured, haunted self the house had exposed. He closed his eyes and whispered the name he had forgotten. The room shook, the mirrors shattered inward, exploding like stars collapsing, their shards dissolving into dust. When he opened his eyes, the house was gone. Only the orchard remained, silent and still beneath a pale dawn. Jonas stood alone, the red thread unspooling at his feet, finally at rest. The first light of dawn bled slowly across the sky, washing the world in soft hues of pink and amber. The heavy fog that had clung to the orchard lifted like a veil, revealing rows of trees standing silent and bare, their branches stark against the awakening horizon. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and new beginnings. Jonas stood at the edge of the orchard, the red thread, a remnant of the house's grip, loose and faded at his feet. His breath rose in gentle clouds, mingling with the morning air as he gazed across the endless rows of trees. The spirals that had haunted his mind were nowhere to be seen. The oppressive weight of the house's memories had finally lifted. Yet, beneath the peace, something lingered, a quiet pulse, faint but persistent, like the distant heartbeat of a place that would never truly let go. He took a step forward, feeling the soft earth beneath his boots, solid and real. Each step was release, a reclaiming of self after the endless spiral of shadow and reflection. Behind him, the orchard stretched wide and empty, a labyrinth of branches and roots, but no longer a prison. The house was gone, or perhaps it was sleeping, waiting in the depths of forgotten dreams. Jonas exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The dawn wrapped around him like a promise, not a forgetting, but a remembering with clarity, free from the house's grasp. He looked up at the rising sun, its light spilling warmth over the world. And as the morning bird began to sing, Jonas walked forward, out of the orchard, away from the spiral, and into the quiet hope of a new day.